Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to the first bonus episode of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Today's bonus episode offers something different than our normal conversation with an historian. It offers a conversation with Richard Natowski and Steve Pickford, two gentlemen who are not professional historians, but who happen to know a lot about a very special place, Longfellow's Wayside Inn in Sudbury, Massachusetts. Have you ever heard the lines, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year." That, my friend, is the opening stanza of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Landlord's Tale, which we remember today as The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. The Landlord's Tale was part of Longfellow's 1863 poetry collection called Tales of a Wayside Inn. The inspiration for Longfellow's Wayside Inn happened to be the Howe Inn and Tavern located on the Old Boston Post Road in Sudbury, Massachusetts. Longfellow's publication of Tales of the Wayside Inn brought the Howe Inn and Tavern notoriety, which helped to keep it open so that it now operates as the oldest inn still in operation in the United States. This bonus episode is an opportunity for me to answer a listener request for more information about colonial inns and taverns, as well as an opportunity for me to share an historic site that has played an important role in my life. Okay, golly, my history with the Wayside Inn stretches back almost 30 years. When my brother and I were little kids, my parents used to tell us to get all dressed up, so we'd get all dressed up in our fancy clothes, and they'd take us to dinner at the Wayside Inn. And in the fall, they would occasionally take us to the annual Minuteman Festival. Now, when we got to the Wayside Inn, little kids will be little kids. We really thought it was like this old house, fancy food, can't get food on your nice clothes. So we weren't necessarily impressed. But as we grew older, we really began to appreciate the history of the place. So by the time I reached my mid to late 20s and my partner Tim asked me to marry him, I could think of no better place to celebrate our future lives together than the Wayside Inn, which hosted both our wedding ceremony in its Martha Mary Chapel and our reception in the dining room. And even today, my parents still insist on taking us out for an annual dinner to the Wayside Inn. Every year around Christmas, my parents coordinate with us and they take my brother and I and our families to dinner at the Wayside Inn. So even now, almost 30 years later, my brother and I still go to the Wayside Inn and enjoy its amenities and great food. So I hope this episode answers at least some of your questions about early American inns and taverns, and that it inspires you to visit this historic site, dine in its dining rooms, stroll around its really nice scenic and historic grounds, or to surprise your significant other or family with a night or two in its historic rooms. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Richard Natowski and Steve Pickford of Longfellow's Wayside Inn.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Longfellow's Wayside Inn in Sudbury, Massachusetts is the oldest inn still in operation in the United States. Since 1716, the Wayside Inn has served travelers of the Old Boston Post Road. Joining us today to discuss the inn and its history are Richard Natowski and Steve Pickford. Steve Pickford is the 9th innkeeper of the historic Wayside Inn. Prior to becoming innkeeper, Steve served as the executive chef and director of food and beverage for the inn. Richard Natowski has worked as the miller at the Wayside Inn for many years and is an expert on the property and its history. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Steve and Richard.
Great to be here.
The Wayside Inn has its origins in the two-room house that David Howe built in 1707. Would you tell us about how and why he decided to turn his house into an inn in 1716?
Well, you get this. The Wayside Inn straddles the Boston Post Road, the upper Boston Post Road, And David Howe was given about 130 acres of land by his father Samuel. So there was a stream here. Eventually, he dammed it and turned it into a mill site. And this was a busy, one of the main arteries going to and from Boston. So a tavern would have been a logical thing for him to build as a way of getting, obviously, a way of getting more money.
Is the post road, just as it sounds, a road to carry the post from Boston to where?
Well, the Upper Boston Post Road would have connected Boston to Albany and then down to New York City. Then there was a middle and lower post road. So yes, these were places for the mail to be delivered, but also other traffic, both foot traffic and vehicular traffic. But it was one of the main arteries going to and from Boston.
And it was basically a horse-traveled road.
So did the inn also provide facilities for travelers to keep their horses?
Yes. I'm not sure of the date that we started that, but in 1716 we had a four-room house, which had the tavern room and some overnight lodging. But maybe Richard knows about which time we may have been able to board horses as well.
This would have taken place from the earliest days of settlement to the era of the Henry Ford Model T.
We were probably accessible by horseback for 150 years before the automobiles started. So it was
keeping in mind also, Steve, as you know, as we have discussed, that the beast of burden in early Massachusetts was the oxen.
Yes,
I just have to like
everybody
that.
knows that.
Well, the importance of that is obviously the English loved their beef.
Yes.
Whereas they did not eat horse meat. And the good thing about the ox is cheaper to feed, and when they get too old, I hate to talk about this, but that's what they eventually turned into their pot roasts, which we, by the way, still serve.
One of the tavern items.
It's funny that you mentioned the New England love for the ox, because I study Albany, New York in early America, and the Dutch love the horse. And when Henry Knox comes to take the cannon from Ticonderoga, there is a big debate over whether they should use horse or ox. So the New Englanders won out. The cannon were mostly carried by ox.
Also interesting that you mentioned Ticonderoga, because the second innkeeper led the local troops of the Middlesex Regiment from here to the Battle of Ticonderoga from the inn.
Oh, interesting. And that was going to be one of my questions. Did the inn or the Howe family play a small or any prominent role during the American Revolution?
Well, yes. As I said, the second innkeeper, Ezekiel Howe, he was actually appointed the colonel of the local militia from King George. He led the local troops over to the shot-heard round-the-world battle. And about a month or two later, he was commissioned locally to lead the 4th Regiment of the Middlesex militia as well, as we got more and more into it with Britain. So he led the locals to Ticonderoga and Crown Point.
A little aside, back in the late 60s, a former innkeeper, the late great Frank Copies, reorganized that march to Concord, and he helped reorganize the Sudbury Minute militia companies. And every April 19th, on that day, not on a day which observes it, the Sudbury militia gets up about 5 a.m. and they march to Concord. And so that was one of our innkeepers reinstituting that.
We have quite a few reactor groups that use the Wayside Inn as their home base, so to speak.
So I know that 4 generations of the Howe family operated Howe's Tavern between 1716 and 1861. And I wonder if it's possible for you to tell us what kind of accommodations would have been available at Howe's Tavern and Inn, and perhaps maybe how they changed over time.
Well, initially, the first building was a two-room humble dwelling, and then expanded over time. But in those days, people used to share beds, 2 and 3 to a bed. This was common, and due to the severity of any winter, that would have been very welcome. However, as you know, over time, things change, and now we have 10 guest rooms for overnight accommodations. But in the early days, people shared beds, and we have them, and we have several museum rooms upstairs which show just how they were accommodated. And as far as dining, this was done, as we would say, family style. It wasn't like a restaurant, which actually the term restaurant started in France just before the French Revolution. But people would all sit at a common table with the innkeeper at the head of the table.
The reason that they shared beds, just in case anybody's curious about that, was, we didn't have central heating like we do today. It was fireplaces and body heat. We didn't have indoor plumbing. We didn't have, thermostats to adjust the heat. It would be cold except for that fireplace, and you had to keep the fire stoked all night.
And even in the middle of a room, in the middle of winter time, and with a fire going, it might be 55 degrees. Mm-hmm. And that's why we have in the rooms bed warming pans to put between the covers.
But the inn today has heat, so nobody has to share any beds unless they want to, right?
Yes, we do. It's actually too hot in here right now.
So what types of food and drink would the houses serve to their guests?
Well, we actually have several things on the menu, which I shouldn't say exactly because technology changes in kitchens. One of the things we have on our menu is, in the dessert menu, is Indian pudding. Another item we have on our breakfast menu are Johnny cakes. Now, both of these are made with the grain which New Englanders could grow here, and that was corn, although in those days it was called Indian corn, hence Indian pudding. As far as drink, well, Steve is far more knowledgeable about drink than I am, but hard cider from the apples was a standard, as was beer. And the interesting thing about the beer is in Sudbury, South Sudbury, just 2 miles to the east, there was a malting house, and that's obviously what you need to make beer.
Also, molasses was heavily traded in the colonial days, and, of course, everyone knows that was used to make rum. And from what I gather, from what I understand, is whatever they could get their hands on would be what they'd use. I'm sure they were serving tea and coffee, as Richard said, beer, whatever they could distill and use is what they would use. One
of the more important things that they used to make and store in their very cold chambers during the wintertime were pies, in particular mincemeat pie. In those days, it had meat. And they would bake these in their beehive ovens, of which we have 2. But this is a tradition which goes way back to England, to East Anglia. Mm-hmm. And so we have 2 beehive ovens in 2 of our dining rooms.
Sure. And in the early days, a lot of the meats were boiled and stewed until we got into the invention of the Dutch oven and to the actual hearth ovens at the side of the fireplaces that we have in some of these kitchens. And then the roasting of the meat started, and Richard could give a better timeline of that. But a lot of the animals ended up being boiled and stewed.
One of the things we try to hold every winter is an ice harvest, and one of the benefits of the ice harvest is you keep food fresh longer. Whereas in the old days, if you wanted to keep a joint of meat fresh, you would have to barrel and salt it. That was your corned beef, and ice made things a little different. George Washington reportedly was very thrilled with the idea of being able to have a good piece of fresh meat out of season. And he had a small ice house on his property. And we have a rather large ice house behind us, although we really don't use it except for the demonstration.
What is the process like to harvest ice? Are they going out on ponds and taking it out there? Or is it like this winter where there's just so much snow they use the snow as ice?
Last year, what we did is we have an ice house pond. We don't know who dug it out. And across the way is an ice house. That may have been there in the 1860s. But what we do is we go out there. First of all, we have to clear off the snow much of the time. Otherwise, it's not ideal ice and it gets too thick. And then we head through a system of saws and ice plows and tongs and our draft horses, donated by a volunteer friend of ours. We haul the ice on the land, put it near the ice house or in the ice house, and we're waiting eventually in the future whereby we can store more of the ice in the house. But that was a way, by the way, a very practical way of also keeping your dairy cold and fresh. And these ice houses, properly constructed, would last until October and November. So to answer your question, yes, we go out on ponds. Hopefully the ice is thick enough, and we cut it up and haul it in.
So let me ask you this. It's kind of a personal question, but when we go to the Wayside Inn, what do you recommend that we order for dinner? What do you think is the inn's signature dish, or what period dish do you just enjoy eating?
I happen to recommend the prime rib, which is our largest seller, and we do a very good job with it. We cook it for 24 hours at a time, slow cook it overnight, and do a fabulous job with it. And believe it or not, that's somewhat authentic of an item for, probably 150 years. The roast beef and particularly that cut. I recommend the duck as well. It happens to be one of my personal favorites. We do a real good job at it. Serve it with a traditional French orange sauce. All the seafood items are fantastic. We're in New England, so we get spoiled with some of the best seafood in the world. I really tell everybody that anything you see that you like, we're going to stand behind.
However, since we're talking about food, you can't escape drink, and there are two drinks I'd like to install here. One is a syllabub, and the other is a flip. Now, the flip was the big drink in colonial days. It was strong beer, molasses, and a gill of rum. And then it was mulled with a hot poker.
What about the Kuo and the Stonewall?
Those are two other drinks, which you serve here. You serve in
first cocktail.
But I just thought I'd put in a word for the flip and a syllabub, which was, that's another thing I got to talk to you about.
They're all potent.
I have had the Kuwu, and I can tell you it is quite potent. So for a long time, the Howe Tavern, up until about, 1861 or 1862, the Howe Tavern operated as the Howe Tavern and Inn. But today we know it as Longfellow's Wayside Inn. So how did the name and why did the name of the inn change?
It was always known as Howe's Tavern, but when the last Howe died, Lyman, the fame of Longfellow's poem was such that the people who took over the owning of the property, it ceased to be an inn for a few years. They decided to call it the Wayside Inn, and eventually Longfellow's Inn. And this is because of the fame of that poem. Now, as you probably know, or may not know, Longfellow may have been the most popular poet in the English language in a day when poets were far more widely read. And so to capitalize on this being the framework for his Tales of a Wayside Inn, it became known as Longfellow's Wayside Inn. So even before he wrote Tales of a Wayside Inn, Longfellow was a very famous person, so much so that he could retire from teaching at Harvard and continue just to write.
Because of the fame of his poetry and the curiosity of everybody wanting to know where this place was, the next owner, Edward Lemon, bought it in the 1890s and kind of capitalized on that fame and turned everything around then. So, it continued being Longfellow's Wayside Inn during his tenure.
So did Longfellow actually stay at the inn?
He visited here when he was living in Cambridge and, was inspired to write some of that poetry about this place.
Great. Now, what about Henry Ford? I believe in 1923, he tried to buy, or he did buy, the Wayside Inn. What attracted Ford to the inn?
Fairly late in life, about 60, he decided to take an interest in American history. And initially, the Wayside Inn was to be the setting for his colonial village. And he bought almost 3,000 acres of land to protect the place and to secure the water rights. But eventually, I guess the realization of his distance, he was out near Detroit, made him realize that he was too far away to really enjoy it. So he started collecting untold amount of antiques and had them shipped over there. And he built his very, very large and famous Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village. But that initially he had planned to do here. They're just too impractical. And perhaps the Great Depression prevented that also. So what was left here was the Wayside Inn, the mill, the Redstone Schoolhouse, which he brought over from Sterling, and 2,000 acres of beautiful land. And, of course, the barn and the carriage house.
He built the grist mill that we have today. He built the Martha Mary Chapel, and he moved items around the property. And basically, the footprint of the property today is a product of Henry Ford.
But it's only, I shouldn't say only, it's about only about 106 acres, 120 acres now.
125 acres right now.
So today, does the Wayside Inn and its grounds still operate as an open-air museum that people can visit?
Yes, the inn itself has several museum rooms. Now, these are the traditional static museum rooms, period pieces. We have a schoolhouse, late 18th century schoolhouse, not far from the chapel. The barn's across the way, but it's generally not open to the public. And then there's the grist mill about 400 yards upstream, up the road. So this is open to the public.
Does the Wayside Inn ever offer any special events that we should be aware of?
Oh, yeah. We have a lot of events going on. This day and age to sustain taking care of the property, it's not just, you're not able to do it so much just from restaurant revenues. The restaurant revenues can take care of the payroll and paying vendors and stuff like that. But with 125 acres and all these buildings, we have to continually be, trying to bring people in here to, make additional revenues from the restaurant. But they're all restaurant food and beverage related. We just had an Irish whiskey dinner last week. It was very successful, sold out in a week. We have a murder mystery dinner this week that's coming up. A bourbon dinner coming up the end of the month. It's open to the public. Wine dinners offering Napa Valley wines and food meal and everything. We have the March reenactment in April 19th coming up, where the active militia volunteer group, they march on that day, and they get some spectators watching. They do a battle reenactment as well in the fall. We have the local fife and drum corps reenactors that play here every Wednesday. They do their practice on Wednesdays outside, march around the property.
At 8 o'clock.
Then come in and end up in the tavern after. And they do that through October. We have a colonial fair that's in the last weekend, the last Saturday in September, that brings a few thousand people to the property, spectators, and a lot of events going on. We have some authentic sheep shearing show that Richard helps host. We have the ice cutting from year to year. However, this year was a little too snowy. We have authentic fox hunts on the property. We had a couple last year and a couple scheduled for this year as well, which is part of our heritage. So we have a lot of activities going on that bring spectators, bring people to keep them entertained.
We have also meets once a week an 18th century dance troupe. A few people like to do the old dances.
Yep.
And in July, we have strawberry concerts.
Yeah, wow. Do you face any challenges while you're trying to simultaneously run this historic preservation operation and this modern restaurant and facility? I mean, it sounds like you're mixing and matching, history and modern day events.
So financially, it's difficult, because you have to sustain a 125-acre property and upkeep not only the property, but you can't neglect any of the buildings. We have 9 buildings. We've been here 300 years. My job is to maintain and make sure it's here for another 300 years at my little point in time here. You always have to think with the thought process that if I make this decision, how's it going to impact them 50 years, 100 years from now?
Great. Now, before we conclude, I know you've told us about a lot of the special events the Wayside Inn holds, but what's coming up around the anniversary of Lexington and Concord around April 19th and maybe, just at the start of the summer?
We have a lot of property to just walk and meander around and, a lot of buildings to check out. We have a lot to do when you visit here. It's not just a restaurant. We operate the grist mill. One can walk up there and on occasion see Richard grinding the mill. If not, he can discuss everything that's going on there. We have a chapel which is beautiful for pictures, and we do weddings there on the weekend, and there's a lot of people on the campus on the weekends. We have the schoolhouse open for visits on the weekend, and just walking around and looking at structures like the ice house and taking in what they, what type of history they belong to way back when. We have a barn that, you take a peek in there and it brings you back. And the barn was built around 1825-ish. It's just fascinating to stand there and look at it and say, this was once full of oxen. Here it is today, and here I am taking pictures of it. We have a gatehouse that, was at the entrance to the property, Edward Lemon era that Henry Ford moved, but it's a beautiful structure, and people used to arrive through that gatehouse, and it had a bell on top. Apparently, the bell would be rung to notify the workers here that, hey, we have some guests now, so everybody got ready for the arrival. And just fun to walk around and take it all. It's a beautiful property. Some rolling fields. We have a trout pond. We stock it with trout every year. Just a nice place to hang out, even if you just want to have a picnic lunch by the grist mill, or if you really want to get into your history.
And where is the best place to look for more information about the Wayside Inn and how to make reservations for dinner or perhaps for our next relaxing weekend getaway?
We have a book that's a history of Longfellow's Wayside Inn. We sell in the gift shop. If somebody called the front desk, we could probably get one out into the mail to them. But it's a pretty nice summary of our past, all about settling of this particular area, how the Wayside Inn evolved, its different innkeepers. It's a full history of everything we're all about. And, it's probably the best one-book synopsis of us.
Great. And do you have a website we could visit as well and get more information about your site and how to make reservations?
We do, and it's LongfellowsWaysideInn.org. And that also has a history part to it. You can research a little bit there, but it's much more extensive to come here and read a little bit about it, talk to the staff, walk around, enjoy the grounds, enjoy the restaurant. We also have a tavern that was issued its license in 1716. So just, the nostalgia of sitting there next to the fireplace, not the fire in the summertime, but, just sitting there having your favorite cocktail or whatever, and just the feel of, knowing that there was so much history through that room. It's just different for everybody.
And that could be documented. We're not just throwing that date out there like some places do. 1716 is an accurate date.
Great. Well, Richard and Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here on Ben Franklin's World.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Wayside Inn has a fascinating story that dates back to 1716. I am always excited to dine at the inn and spend a day on its grounds because not only is it an historic place, but it is beautiful and scenic. It's a wonderful place to spend a day. And when you visit the inn, I hope you take the opportunity to sample its food, which is quite excellent. Although, just a note of caution, if you stop by the bar and try one of their traditional colonial period cocktails, be sure to either spend the night or share your evening with a designated driver. They're quite strong. You can find information about the Wayside Inn, its special events, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, which you'll find at benfranklinsworld.com/wayside. Did you enjoy this bonus episode? Would you like to learn more about historic places and experiences, even when the site does not have a professional historian on staff? Please let me know. You can send your thoughts to liz@benfranklinsworld.com or tweet them to me @Liz Covart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.